Cool, everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the catalog sync. And we have moved the meeting for this time zone to also to 9 a.m. Pacific time. So looks like we have a very similar quorum here. So glad to see everyone. And for the highlights, I don't think we have any major things merged in the catalog spec. Or is there anything people want to bring up?
So
Okay.
actually, I had one beginner question to be. This is my first meeting in the catalog discussion here, and I saw one commit about the query planning which merged into the catalog, and I was just wanted to get the community opinion there that this is a feature which is more aligned with the optimizers, and if as a principle. The catalog, should we keep it simple so that it could be adopted broadly and it's easy to adopt and keep optimizer as a separate service? Maybe aligned very well with this component, but these kind of features in future also, how does it look like? I don't want to derail the agenda. There is already a couple of items, but it's something which I wanted to definitely understand, and based on that, continue.
I think middle of the week it tends to be available.
Yeah, I would respond to that in saying that like there may be elements that overlap at that level where an optimizer with the native implementation might be able to do a couple smart things. But this is also at the very like lowest level of the table scan. So most of the things that you could do against the Iceberg library as a scan, you can do against that set of endpoints. So it's also not a requirement. It's an optional implementation for clients who understand how to do that. So for any like sophisticated query engine that is, highly tuned and natively integrated, I don't think the expectation is they have to use that endpoint. But I'm also not convinced that there's a lot of cases that like the optimizer wouldn't be able to get the same result, because you're probably going through that same kind of interface for the actual native implementation too. But I do think it's worth calling out that like, hey, if we're doing more complicated things, especially in the catalog space, maybe that's drifting into an area that we should kind of question, like, yeah, is that really engine behavior, or is this really storage and table format behavior? And I think we've called out a number of cases where it's like we're kind of straddling that line, both in terms of runtime components and the library itself. So always good to call out. I'm not sure that we've crossed that bar quite yet. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, exactly right. I wasn't sure what are the principles applied to such things and where is the bar, and same for even on the like couple of other places where the parquet files, for example, may end up increasing in size because of optional features. So, and it's sometimes hard to tune, right? Like what's the default value as a service provider, right? What's the default value? And if you're building a catalog implementation, should you provide it? What does optional mean here? And it just creates a little bit confusion, hence the question. But thank you so much.
I think we'll even get a couple more that are like in that same line. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of variation, but we do want to be careful. Like, I don't think there's any intention to make Iceberg an actual engine. And we're kind of aware of like where those lines are. So, Ife?
Yeah, thanks. Along the implementation, we also discussed that in case of the big table with a huge amount of the metadata manifest files, and probably REST catalog, the catalog server itself is not the best place to hold the whole processing. We have to delegate to another system for the processing. Same with delete with purge. Service side planning this will purge. We also like there's potential the server had to handle huge amount of data, which slow down the server itself, and the delegation to another system to do that potentially is option for huge tables. This is kind of an implementation of the implication of the implementation. Yeah.
Yes, Ashwin, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you so much. That helps.
Okay, so I guess for the topics, we had quite a few leftovers even from the last meeting, so I think we can proceed to that. The first one, let me see, is the fine-grained metadata commit and commit API. I think Drew from my team added this, but I think he's not here today, so maybe we can punt that one first and go to the second one, which is standardized vending credentials using load table. I think Edward, this is from you, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the goal of this PR is to essentially standardize different credentials, which we later want to use for a different proposal, which I haven't written up yet, for having a mechanism to refresh those vendor credentials. And so it's essentially what we have right now in the spec is load table, load view response would return a list of credentials. And you could technically also have multiple credentials of the same type if you want to provide specific credentials for, like a certain prefix of your table path. There have been a lot of reviews on the PR. I think only Dimitri replied on the discussed thread, but I think the discussion is down to having an additional layer above what is currently proposed in the PR versus going with what's in the PR.
Yeah, I think that's my comments. So basically, right now, every time we load a table, this PR is trying to add one more object, which is credential. And along with that, we actually have the configuration map, which emits all these the FireIO relates the property like S3 regions, and the other thing like GCP has its own properties. So right now, my comments is what if because we're gonna have a multiple kind of the storage types, GCP, S3, and Azure ADS. Then for each type of the storage, can we have one single object to hold both the credential as well as the file configurations? This is one minor structure change, which kind of looks like a little bit more organized on itself. Instead of right now, it's most of the configuration is kind of a schema less, which is the common stitching of that spec itself. Yeah, Daniel, you wanna?
Yeah, so I understand the motivation behind that. My concern is just we don't want the spec to get into a situation. I'm also a little bothered by like even the way that we represent credentials, though I've caved on this. And it's that anytime where we're like enumerating things that are specific to storage implementations, we're actually limiting the scope of the spec. So if we went through and we defined like, hey, here is a S3 storage object and a Azure storage object, well then, the Huawei cloud, like they're not defined in the spec. They're actually excluded from the spec. They don't have a representation. R2, MinIO, like new storage classes that come up, the ones that are like on-prem that we don't see typically, like all of these, then we either need to incorporate specific versions of, or they kind of get excluded from the spec. And so more and more, I'd prefer to have generalized concepts that we can reuse across different implementations. The credentials one, originally we started out with just properties, and there was enough like concern from other parties that like, hey, that's not clear enough for us, or like we're afraid that those properties are going to change and it's going to break on us. So we're hesitant to kind of leverage the credential mechanism there, which is why we want to promote it and actually make it a first-class concept. But I would have been much happier if it was like, hey, we can just have an OAuth with access token and expiration. But like AWS has very specific things. Azure has slightly other, things that you may need to include. So we've already broken some of those out, but we're already limited to the 3 clouds in terms of the credential representation. So the further we take that, the more we actually limit the scope of what the spec can actually address. So if possible, what I'd like to see is like, if we're going to break out a storage, as a separate, first class item within that response object, like what are the specific use cases? What are the fields that we would actually include in that? Are they generic? Are we now like going through and enumerating a bunch of stuff for each, cloud and storage provider? It really complicates the spec for us. And like, I think we want it to be as generic as possible. Does that make sense, Yufei?
Yeah, I think so. It makes sense to me. So this managing, so another point I want to bring out is, so one of the reasons we're trying to kind of apply schema to credentials as well as the configuration is just in case anything changed. For example, there's a new key for certain credentials has been changed. Since we have a schema on the Iceberg side, so that changing will be mapped automatically from the server side. So what a client got is still the old key, and it would want to break the client, right? This is, I feel I'm agree with that. Schema less maybe a good thing because we want it to be more flexible and to support more stuff. But at the same time, when we're talking about the compatibility issues, apply schema is a good thing.
So the other thing that we run into though is that, like, especially for the configuration options, they're not consistent across implementations, right? So if you're putting properties in there that are storage related, the AWS Java SDK has different properties than like the Arrow Python library, the Arrow C++ library. So you're going to have things that we can enumerate and we can say, hey, these are configurations, but then like they're very narrowly scoped. And that's now just kind of a question of like, hey, do those just really belong in a table object? We're not saying that we can't pass that information and the implementations, can then choose to respect it or not, but does it really need to be defined in the spec? Like, is it actually a requirement? So I think that we need to be a little careful there and not like over spec what we're putting into this. I mean, we can do quite a bit right now. And so it's like, well, what added value are we getting when we add like a bunch of incremental, like small properties here? I do think documenting them is important, like, in the documentation, but does it actually need to be in the spec? Maybe.
Yeah, if I may, I think it's important to keep the spec language agnostic and also kind of, I would say, storage or credential agnostic, because else it will not be sustainable. Like if tomorrow we add a new service, how we can deal with this new service. So in my opinion, especially about credential and authentication system, I would say that just key value pairs with a prefix of the implementation and let the implementation deal with that is probably easier. And as you said, Daniel, I think it makes sense to document it at least, but nothing more in the spec. So using an extension, why not Huawei Cloud extension, AWS extension, whatever, just to specify in terms of documentation, this is the way it works, but not in the REST spec by itself, because if tomorrow we add a new authentication system, how are we gonna? It doesn't make sense to release a new version of the spec just to maintain this first. And second thing is think about Python, Rust, and extra. I think that we should not be too much focused on Java, in my opinion.
Jack?
So I think when I was reviewing the PR, I was in the stance that what is in the PR right now makes sense to me, especially what Edward explained that seems like the next step is we want to introduce a dedicated endpoint to refresh credentials. And in that case, having a specific credentials object, and then that is also surfaced in the load table. And the way to leverage that is file will, of course, still take the config, and then credentials is kind of like a overriding that in addition to the config is supplied to the files. That seems to make sense to me in general. But Dan, when you say we don't want to be over-specking, in that case, why not just have a new credentials map? And the credentials refreshing API also is refreshing like a map, and that becomes kind of storage system specific. Why was that, or is that considered actually?
Well, I mean, it's pretty much equivalent to what we're doing right now. And there was a bit of pushback that like it wasn't well specified because like we have the properties, or we have some of the properties in the spec already. We were missing the GCS and Azure like actual property names in the spec itself. And so there was a fair amount of feedback that like, hey, we want these as well-defined objects. As opposed to just like property names, because they're worried, people were worried that like, oh, we're just going to change the property names and it's going to break everybody. I think spec, whether it's written or formal, like is part of the spec. I think there should be pushback if you try and change it. I'm actually not too opposed to that. I think I would have liked to see like something that was like, hey, it's OAuth and all the cloud providers are consistent, but you're right, like that actually doesn't support potentially some implementations that have different structures or different numbers of properties. So I'm open to the idea of a property map, but that's already what we have, right?
I think there's a line between everything is in config and everything is very specified in a dedicated object, versus I think you are saying that seems like you are receiving requests about credentials are important enough to be its independent thing. Then if that's the case, a dedicated field of credentials, which is the structure of that is a map, does that kind of solve the concern? I don't know. Maybe we can discuss. Yeah. But overall, I'm okay with what is in the PR right now. But if we have a concern about making that general, I think that might be something we can consider.
Yeah, the only like additional things that this adds over to what was in the table map, and like of course you can like represent anything you want in properties if you make it complicated enough, but the one additional thing that I think the latest version of Edwards is that there's like a prefix associated with the credential, because some people had asked about like, well, what if I have a table that like spans, multiple buckets, or sorry, cloud providers actually. Because if you're within a cloud provider, you can still provide credentials that span buckets. I think that's generally acceptable across all the cloud providers. But if you are spanning actual cloud providers, being able to provide credentials that map, GCS, AWS, and Azure all in the same payload, so you can have, files in all of those clouds. That's a bit of a reach. I don't know anybody who's actually doing that currently, though I think Apple may have a couple cases. But that was the one additional thing that this was kind of addressing is in terms of an actual use case. That would be hard to represent in just like the table property map.
Okay. Guess Dimitri, you're next.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, generally, I agree on the point that we shouldn't overspecify things. So if we want to define credentials as kind of like a pluggable things where we provide some kind of a discriminator, and then the extension defines what actually goes into that particular credential in terms of specific properties, that's perfectly fine from my point of view. We don't really need to enumerate every possible value. And but if we go that way, I think it would be preferable maybe to just take one extra step and do this in the new endpoint rather than in the config maybe. But it's kind of not really critical. Now, to my bigger point I wanted to mention is that I think the spec doesn't have to specify exactly what credentials, how they look, but I think the spec needs to deal with this at a conceptual level, right? Basically, do we allow multiple credentials per table? And more importantly, how we resolve URLs or URIs, I should say, to perform access, right? Because, for example, if we have S3 my bucket, it means one thing in AWS, it means a totally different thing in MinIO, right? But the actual URI is the same. What I'm saying is that given the URI, you cannot always identify the location or the method of access, right?
I would argue against that point. Like, I understand that there are a lot of places that are using like compatibility, like the scheme and things like that as compatibility, but endpoint is another one of those properties, right? That has been undefined, but you could argue, hey, that's part of the property of the credential itself. Like, hey, what is the endpoint? Maybe you need that for VPC or networking or something like that for Azure. Like, they have account level URLs that you have to hit. But I wouldn't necessarily say that we want to do anything special about like interpreting the URIs in some way.
However, given I mean, if we're talking about like the classical Iceberg where client runs and deals with table metadata, maybe not. But in the context of the REST catalog, the way I see it at least is that a client talks to the server, gets metadata from the server, and that metadata has a URI. Now the client has to interpret that URI somehow to perform access. Once, as part of that interpretation, it needs to annex an endpoint and credentials. An endpoint, I mean the actual HTTP plus S3 region, for example, and all that stuff, right? So I think it would be good if we had that kind of conceptual mapping defined in the spec.
Yeah, and actually, I think to that point, I wanted to. I think I was also thinking about a similar point, that the config, there's dual roles. Like there's kind of things, maybe even three different categories that I think about it. One is there's things about how you should handle the credential itself, like expires at time or maybe prefix would be something a little bit agnostic to the specific implementation of the storage, but it's something that maybe you would expect shared abstract class to be able to sort of like say that, this is how we have an engine that decides when to issue a refresh or whatever, right? Then there's things that are like the credential itself, so like some kind of a bundle, maybe a key value map that constitutes what you need to pass through to the storage layer. And then a third category is almost something like the necessity of the config itself, like as Dimitri pointed out, like things like it could be related to the endpoint. It could be some other kind of abstract thing that relates to like how you're supposed to hit the endpoint. Maybe you have to override like a proxy setting for HTTP or something. And those are generalized config. And I guess generally we've liked the fact that config kind of gives us an auto magic way to plumb things through to client libraries, I guess. And so that's probably still necessary. So I guess one thing to keep in mind is like that bundle of like things for telling the client how to access the storage, the things for like the opaque bundle of credentials, strings to actually use, and then there's sort of like metadata about the credential should all be represented kind of in a way that can be cohesive, I guess. And then my other point was actually the multi-bucket is going to be a much more prominent topic for use cases that I've seen, and not just multi-location. And I think like that should probably be something that we give more thought to if we're going to have any notion of specifying prefixes for credentials.
I just want to respond to this came up in the thread a little bit too. We need to be clear about the distinction between like what we're defining for credentials and what we're defining for the client. Because things like, hey, who does the client talk to? What are the configurations for the client? Those are client level configuration. They're not credentials, right? And even things like I think region was brought up a number of times. Like from my experience, most of the cloud providers, all of their IAM auth stuff is pretty global. Like you don't need to go and specify, oh, I need to go talk to this region. That's more of a bucket. Who am I talking to for the actual physical data access? So separating those concerns, and maybe this gets back to Yufei's point of like having some sort of storage set of properties that we can respect, some sort of credential things that are like independent of that, but they overlap in terms of like what credentials allow you access to what storage. I think it would be worth going through the config and seeing like how many of these do we actually have across the different implementations, because endpoint is the only one that I know of, and I think it's only for AWS right now in terms of our current reference implementation. And maybe that's enough to justify that, like, hey, we have to have some way to define that for the reading client. But beyond that, like, I want to be careful that we aren't just like, expanding the scope of this to the point where it's not realistic in terms of like how people would actually use this. It's easy to, land grab and expand scope, but is it really necessary?
Yeah, and I wanted to respond to like, I think for the endpoints, I would say also, as Dimitri mentioned, I think the S3 compatible endpoints are one big one, but also there's the FIPS endpoints, VPC endpoints. I know GCP has global versus regional endpoints that you can pick. So that might be actually a good driving example of something that maybe we want to document, but also hints that like you said, it's not necessarily part of the credential. And another thought that comes to mind is that remote signing based credential delegation, like that's not actually passing through a credential per se. It actually is more like a storage config that happens to satisfy your credential needs, right? So it's interesting that seems like it's almost middle ground. Like that could be expressed more as like open-ended config, and yet is your credential.
You went to remote signing. I missed, like, what was the relation to remote signing?
Well, so right now in config, right, like the documentation for how to do access delegation can be either vended credential or remote signing. So conceptually, it's lumping remote signing together with like a credential config, but like remote signing wouldn't fit into this idea of like giving you a bundle. I mean, it almost like it's not giving you a credential as your property per se. It's saying like you should configure your client to do remote signing at this endpoint. So like that piece feels more like general config, even though it's part of access delegation.
Dimitri.
Yeah, to expand on Dennis's point, at least the way I see it, how this discussion progresses, right? So we started with defining vended credentials, which is a good initiative. And however, I think it kind of opens up different use cases that we didn't consider as much before, right? So, and as Dennis said, I think it goes into the direction where we need to deal with how exactly we access tables, right? So once we go into this access mode, then we have to make the decision whether we actually going to get a vended credential, whether we're going to have to do remote signing, perhaps something else, which is also some future proofing. Maybe we need to think about that, right? So what I'm trying to say is that we can probably settle on the proposal in the PR regarding vended credential structures, but I think we have to make another adjustment and basically at least consider how clients should be interpreting the information they get from the REST catalog in terms of like formatting, what exactly they need to do to access a particular table.
Jack.
I'm raising hand just for time check because we have 30 minutes left and we have quite a few topics. So do we have a good next step to here?
So let's take this offline. Edward, we should look into maybe the right answer here is actually to roll back. We can try and hunt down the people that were asking for the fully specified credential and see if like a credential map would be sufficient, because that may also address the questions about future like remote signing configuration. It would just be a different set of properties that we define as like these are the values that will be set under certain conditions. It's not expansive. Other implementations may have different properties that they set. We're not being restrictive, but we are being prescriptive about the ones that we know about and support. And then, we can also take a look with Yufei about like the storage structure concept, like how does that fit? How would that differ from the credentials? Do we need two sets of maps? Like, are we getting into this just like maps of properties? Or is there some way to like simplify this in a meaningful way? So let's take that offline. Let's go to the dev list or the doc and follow up on those items.
Okay, thank you. So the next topic is OAuth2 authentication guide. I think this is from Christian.
Yeah, right. I didn't put it in the list. Maybe someone else did, but I wanted to discuss it eventually here. Yeah, so one thing that is currently missing for me a little bit in the spec is, well, actually, it's not missing in the spec. It's just a guide that is missing, a guide for clients how to use OAuth with the Iceberg REST specification. The reason for this, why is it missing? So if we have a little look at the history, what we used to have is we had the client credential flow basically as part of the REST API. And then, we noticed that, this isn't the right place. It should belong to an IDP. So we removed it. However, if we look now at all of the client's implementations out there, we have the decision between token, externally specified token basically, and client credentials. So with this guide, what I'm trying to do is just map standards that already exist as part of OAuth2 and as part of Iceberg REST. So Iceberg REST just defines, please use OAuth2 or AWS Zigbee 4. So use OAuth2 and it just maps how OAuth2 works in this data context, basically. The purpose of this is to encourage clients to implement more flows, because what is fundamentally missing today are flows that are suitable for humans. Client credential flows are suitable for applications, which is, of course, the most important bit. I mean, that's what we use most of the time. We have an application interacting with a catalog. But we might also want to have, eventually a browser application, a single page application that needs to use authorization flow, or also a user using Spark or Trino or whatever else in a browser window. So basically in a Jupyter notebook, should use a human suitable flow, because otherwise we would rule out a lot of IDPs out there to actually work with our catalog. So yeah, so basically by putting this all in this guide, I thought that this would encourage clients, including our own, like all of the Apache Iceberg -star repositories, so Rust, Python, Java, they all don't implement these flows. So by putting this into a guide, basically, on how to do this, I think we can encourage clients to actually implement those flows. And then while on it, maybe also harmonize properties so that they don't diverge. So because this has already happened in the past, if you look, for example, at Starox, I opened a few issues for them regarding this. They are using a different way to configure OAuth2 than Trino does, for example. They're doing it in a not so good way, and they acknowledge this, and they are going to change to the Trino way of doing it, so basically nesting all the properties under OAuth2. But I think this is like having a recommendation from the project wouldn't hurt. I acknowledge someone already made a note in the document that what I'm currently missing is a standardization for programming languages, which is right. This isn't in there yet, but we should probably just recommend to use like something in the lines of what's recommended in the spec. Yeah. So my overall goal, apart from having this, implemented in the clients, I think, or to get there, my next step would be, or I think first we need to align. We need to align here. We need to align on the document. If we are aligned, I would migrate everything to a Markdown document. I think it would or should be part of the Iceberg documentation, and then we can go ahead and actually modify all those client applications out there to actually support those flows. Yeah. Daniel?
Yeah, I definitely have a couple questions. Like, I do think that documentation and guidance on how to build and use this is very helpful. Like, we put some information in the spec. It probably wasn't particularly clear. At the same time, like, I think it's also helpful to understand like the thought process behind the original implementation and how we're thinking about like just how the interfaces kind of operate and what we expect many implementers of like a server side would actually be doing with this. And that is that like OAuth is kind of the initial entry point to the REST catalog. And like the most important point that you have some sort of credential validation is actually when you hit the config endpoint, right? Because that's a point, that's the first touch point with any client to the server, ideally. That is the intended flow. And at that point, though, like part of the mechanism that we kind of try and describe in the actual REST spec is that from that point on, you could either choose to continue using some external like IDP's token, or it can be actually switched to one that is owned by the catalog. And then the catalog can kind of manage the context and know that it has delegated this access for further requests against that catalog. So that's why in that config response, you can send back a token that the catalog can then say, hey, I've already authenticated this person. I use their IDP to validate it's registered with us. It gets well known. We're gonna like acknowledge who that individual is, if it's OIDC or like some other system coming in. And then we can swap over to our own mechanism for credential management through the rest of the API interactions. That isn't required. Like any implementation, continue to use that external IDP's token. But we wanted to provide the option so that then the scoping of the access is able to be managed by the actual catalog from that point forward. Does that make sense?
It does. Maybe Dimitri go first and then I go next.
Yeah. Thanks, Christian. So then when you describe this token exchange flow, do you mean it actually works now, or is it just envisioned?
No, it works now. It works now.
Oh,
Like
really?
it's up to the the catalog to implement a more complicated mechanism for this. But there are already like when you do a config request, it can hand back a token, and the reference implementation in Java and Python will then use that token for subsequent requests. And those requests, like a load table, can hand back a different token that then it can use for subsequent requests. So like you can, the catalog itself can kind of control the context at which it allows requests past that config endpoint.
Yes. Oh, I guess I should have said I meant it in the sense of OAuth 2 protocol.
Well, the OAuth 2 protocol is actually, and this is part of the reason we kind of removed it from the spec, is that it happens before, right? Most of that interaction happens before. A lot of the implementation around OAuth 2 exchanges right now is based on that endpoint that we had defined in the rest of it.
Yeah, but we have a problem. So first of all, Daniel, I think Alex or someone just wrote in the spec that we're talking about two different things, and I think that's right. So first of all, like the case that the catalog exchanges the token and sends it back is part of the document that I wrote, because I know how Tabular works, and so I put in that each client, of course, should respect if the server decides to exchange the token, it should respect that. But it's not a necessity of the server to actually do this, right? So it might not exchange it. And if it doesn't exchange it, we currently have a problem, because client tokens, like you say, the flow happened before, but I disagree, because if the flow happens before, then we can never have any long-running request. So let's assume we have like user tokens, they are typically only valid for a few hours, and they shouldn't be valid longer, right? So but a user still might want to, have it open Jupyter Notebook, log in with Spark via a user suitable flow. Like you cannot give a user client ID and client secret. It would be just like username and password. It's just not considered secure. So the user can do the flow externally, which is also something that I describe in the document. But then while doing the flow externally, the user gets back 2 tokens, an access token and a refresh token. And then at least the client, like the Iceberg library there, needs to take care of refreshing the token if the server doesn't do it for him. So at least we need this refresh mechanism. And ideally, I mean, if we follow this argumentation all the way through, then we would also have to get rid of the client credential flow because it happened before, right? So why should it be part of the library? So this specification is nothing that, I mean, the old flows are still there, but I think we are missing some other flows that should be in there that would simplify life for various clients.
Okay, so it's like stepping back a little bit and like at a very generic level, if we said, hey, we've got a REST server implementation, it doesn't do anything with tokens. Okay, like it doesn't have any of the implementation for like minting new tokens, sending new tokens back to any endpoint or anything like that. And you could build an implementation like this. I think that's entirely possible. And then any client that's coming to it can use an external ID. And as long as the server can say like, oh, I understand Google, like Google tokens, like I can go and validate them. I can get the identity of the individual, and then I'll handle that as a server regardless of which endpoint they come in, right? Then OAuth still exists protocol. It is the it's the authorization mechanism that the server is using, but it is entirely handled outside of the catalog space, right? So that is like the most like, hey, nothing about like how we handle or hand back tokens or anything like that.
Yes. The problem with this approach is just that at least the client needs this refresh mechanism somehow.
Well, but it's doing that against an external IDP at that point. Like whatever, like, if you're
yes, but with the Iceberg library, like with the current Iceberg library, how would we ever like refresh a token like while Spark is running? Like a user's using, Python to do the initial authorization, gets back its token, then uses Spark, which just uses the Iceberg library under the hood to run its query, and it takes a long time. So of course you can give it the token externally initially, but how is it going to be refreshed?
Again, like, so in this scenario,
yes, sorry, Daniel, may I just offer a practical example? Yeah, sorry for the interruption, but I think what Christian means is that hypothetically, suppose we have a catalog implementation that accepts tokens provided by an IDP, and suppose the IDP is Keycloak, right? Now I want to configure the device code flow in Keycloak, and I want a Spark client, Iceberg running in a Spark job to authenticate against Keycloak using the device flow, and then communicate to the catalog using the access token that was provided by Keycloak, and also be able to refresh that token as it expires, right? I don't think this is possible right now.
So this would be more of the client side, like HTTP REST implementation and how it manages whatever credential is provided to it, whatever authorization.
Yeah, exactly. At least for the initial access, and then if we want to exchange for a scope down token, that's a separate concern, I think.
Exactly. Yeah. So yes. So I mean, first, I think we need to establish that we actually need this on the client side. And like my argumentation also in the document is we need at least a refresh mechanism. Like that's the lowest level of integration we can have there. And then the second level would be, well, if we only have the refresh mechanisms, there is only a handful of flows that are recommended by OAuth 2 basically in different scenarios. So we already opted in to implement the client credential flow, which isn't the most recommended, by the way, for applications, but it's there and it's widely supported. So for some reason, we opted to implement it because it makes things easier, right? So the clients do not need to make this flow externally. And I think that with the same argumentation, we should eventually also support more flows for users so that users do not need to make it externally. So basically a two-step approach. Like first, refresh externally provided tokens. Second, make it easier for users of the library to not to remove the need to actually initially have this external flow, just like client credential flow is also handled internally.
Yeah, I think that there are kind of two sides to this problem, though. There's the one where it's like, hey, I'm using Keycloak as a client. I want to be able to configure my HTTP client to do all the proper refreshes, use whatever flows are necessary. That seems like a client-side implementation detail that we need to figure out. And there may be libraries that encompass all this behavior, like Auth0 or something that you could plug in. You just provide it the information, what flows, and it's going to go in the background and refresh and do everything for you. They're probably out there. The other side of it, though, is kind of the mechanisms defined within the REST catalog about tokens and token expiration. And these are two different things. Like where you're getting the token from, that's now like the catalog server itself providing this. And it's somewhat different than working with an IDP.
So okay, I mean, I know that there are implementations out there where actually the catalog provides tokens, but fundamentally, but that's maybe also a philosophical question. I don't think this is the right way to go. An IDP is there to issue tokens, so an IDP should be used. Because if the client issues the catalog issues tokens in a way, it either needs to exchange them with an external IDP or needs to manage certificates internally, which is a very, very hard thing to do. But following this argumentations, like, why do we have the client credential flow? Shouldn't we get rid of this?
Shouldn't we get rid of the client credential flow?
Exactly. I mean, following your argumentation that this should happen externally, I agree we shouldn't. But it's stressing the same point. It's doing the same thing, right? It's getting a token from an external IDP. You can specify an external IDP in one way. So why do we restrict ourselves to getting a token in this one way and do not accept two other ways to do this?
Well, I don't think that there's necessarily, we're not preventing it from happening. We're just not saying it's like done by default in the reference implementation currently. Like you have a mechanism to actually just provide the token that was the result of whatever other exchange that you did, right? And that was the point of being able to just pass through a token, is that could be done after you've already done this exchange ahead of time. So like in your Spark setup script or something like that, you could go do whatever exchange you want and provide an arbitrary token that was provided by anyone. So it's not that like, hey, we're saying you can't do that. It's like, it's not part of the implementation. But I do think it would be good to, like you said, and I'm agreeing with you, let's document this and let's like write down what these flows look like and what the client should do and what we expect the server to do. I think we'll find that there are gaps, in terms of both like, what is true OAuth and what are kind of passing mechanisms that we've set up as part of the REST protocol to enable like the server to kind of control scope. But we're also going to see that those are slightly different things. And whether that's really true OAuth or not, it's probably not for the way that the REST catalog is handing like scoped tokens back, or the server side can control those. And if there's a better way, I think we're open to it. But I do think that there are actually slightly different use cases. And we're kind of trying to bundle them all under OAuth and then saying like, hey, all these flows should just happen. I think we need to be more clear about like where it's happening and what should actually be doing those operations. So I'm agreeing with you. Let's write it down.
Okay. Yeah, let's write it down. I just stumbled over this one sentence a bit that we have our own I don't know. I don't have the words exactly, but our own version of OAuth 2. Like we shouldn't. Like there is a standard.
And it's our own version of OAuth 2. I'm not calling it OAuth 2. I'm saying that we're passing tokens through the REST API that then are used as subsequent authorization. That's not OAuth 2. It is a mechanism that is used by lots of systems to manage authorization to requests. That is not OAuth 2 though, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, in the REST spec right now, we say it's OAuth 2. That's what it says right at the top. Yeah.
Yes, like and we've taken that out. Like if you look at like after the deprecation, if you took out the pieces that are deprecated, OAuth 2 is not even mentioned in the REST spec.
It is. And
It's,
the,
well, token
and the
token
security.
Oh, as the security, that's probably wrong too for other reasons. Like it's a misuse of probably what like Open API spec is for, because like Open API spec is typically used for declaring what you support, not what people should support as part of this, as part of the implement. So that's a little quirky. So I agree with you there, but it's probably just confusing how that's being used. Dimitri.
Yeah, I think we need to disambiguate that situation where because the client receives a URL for tokens, right, for the token endpoint on startup, it needs that URL to be able to do two things essentially, right? First is it needs to authenticate and receive an access token through that URL, which is essentially OAuth 2, right? I believe it does an OAuth 2 protocol. And the second thing is token exchanging for downscoped token or upscoped or whatever, right, with the catalog. Right now, this all goes through the same configuration property. And I think that part probably is worth disambiguating. And as for the first part, how we actually get the first access token, I think Christian has a valid point, and I think that it's worth implementing that in at least in the Java client, and maybe other languages will follow to enable proper different methods of authentication.
Yeah, I'm actually not arguing with that. I think that's very likely true, but like the net result of that is a client-side implementation that ends up like filling out the token field, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and I'm saying that like, hey, like we didn't say that you couldn't do that. We just didn't prescribe an implementation or a reference implementation that does those other flows. So I definitely think that we can do better on that, and we can probably come up with a reference implementation using standard libraries out there to do all those changes. I think there's a larger question about like, how does that overlap with the other things that we've put in place for how tokens are passed between the server and the client after that point? I'm just saying that like it would be good to write this down and make sure that like if we do want to change it to something that's more standardized, I think we're all happy to do that. But I think we also need to be pretty clear about like what those behaviors are for anybody who's implementing in the future. And Starrock is a perfect example. I think even the Python implementation actually got pieces of it wrong, and they are being fixed, or there are still issues open related to it. So
yeah, sounds good. Yeah, Christian, I'll let you speak. I just wanted to mention that the next topic on the agenda kind of connects to this, and this is basically having some attention to the proposed PR for enabling different authentication methods. So yeah, go ahead, Christian.
Yeah, no, so I just wanted, we should then probably, like, if we say we're not using standard OAuth because it's very well documented, but we use a like token exchange handed back from the server, and what we do here and there, it probably deserves a lot of documentation, because security things are very, very easy to get wrong. So yeah, also regarding lifecycle of the tokens handed back. So what do we ever do if a token we get back from the server expires? How do we refresh it, and so on? So there are a lot of, I think, open points. Should we use the initial token for that? Should we use the new token for that? All these kinds of things. Like personally, my problem is like my server doesn't do it that way. It doesn't exchange a token because I think it's the wrong way to go. For me, the IDP does this thing. So I'm probably not the right person to write this section of the implementation. What I can very well write is this, what we just discussed, the initial, how do clients get the initial token? And this is what I've put in the document. And for the token exchange, I just put in there that it needs to happen, and that if a server responds with a token, the client must use it and override its own token. So this is what is currently in the document. But I don't know, it might not be enough to do it, right? So maybe it would be good if like some of the Java developers, or maybe Daniel, you have someone in mind, could chime in and basically fill out this gap to actually make this a fully fledged document to also include this mechanism.
I'm happy to meet with you and like walk through like the scenarios and what we're trying to represent and everything, and then we can hopefully come to something that encompasses all of that. And it does come down to like specific use cases of like how the server might leverage those capabilities. It isn't required that any implementation do that, but there are things that you can do that are clever and help with the implementation. So why don't we set up some time? You and I can like sync offline, and then we can bring it back to the dev list.
Yeah,
and
sounds
hopefully get a better like understand, because I think you're coming from a very pure like OAuth perspective, and we're coming from like a very implementation specific, like how did we solve certain problems, and we need to like do a little knowledge share there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's sounds good. Perfect. Thanks.
Okay, I think this is a perfect time to conclude this sync. We're at time. And thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you all. Have a nice day.